I started my career as a social worker, and I think that my main goal was trying to find ways to alleviate suffering in the world. I was realizing that people were struggling, and a lot of our interventions weren't effective to the extent that I felt was possible. In my social work career, I had specialized in the treatment of trauma-related disorders, and in that process, I had learned that trauma tends to have significant impacts on the brain. And what I was realizing is that a lot of our interventions were not actually getting to those roots. They were focusing on cognitive strategies and things that were really depending on this frontal part of our brain to be functioning properly. And so as a social worker and a psychotherapist, I was incorporating all the skills that I had learned in my schooling and in my practice and doing the very best that I could for the trauma treatment. So I felt like there had to be more. I felt like there were more things that we could do to really get to the issue, help people truly heal. And in that process, I started to do some research into the brain. I realized that trauma tends to have significant impacts on the brain and can even create physical damage over time. So I realized that a lot of our interventions were not actually getting to the root in the brain. We were addressing the cognitive piece and the emotional piece, which are both incredibly important. But if you don't get to the root in the brain, then the symptoms can continue even despite all of that other work. About 5% of our brain is available to our conscious awareness, and about 95% is subconscious. And oftentimes with a history of trauma, that subconscious brain tends to override that 5% of our conscious brain. So I was realizing that a lot of our clients were struggling because they were really trying to implement a lot of these skills that we had taught them and coping strategies. But what would happen is in the moments they actually needed those skills, they were unavailable to them because that part of their brain was being overridden by that limbic system, that emotion center that comes like a flood. It comes on a lot faster and stronger than that frontal conscious part of our brain. So I realized that we needed to find ways to get to that root and be able to speak with the subconscious brain. And that's actually what led me into neurotherapy. I realized that we could actually scan the brain, we could look at the organ we're treating, actually see where the root is, what's going on, and then have a modality that could address those things directly and target these specific regions that needed to be addressed. What I realized is that trauma has significant impacts on the brain and can actually be harmful and damaging to certain areas that are needed for our emotional regulation, for our cognitive processing, for our relationships. And I realized we needed to find ways to really get to those roots and more effectively heal the brain in order to allow the person to heal. So here at NeuroGrove, our first step is always to do a brain assessment. We believe strongly that we need to look at the organ we're treating. We need to look inside and see exactly how that person's brain is struggling. I think that's where a lot of conventional medicine and a lot of our conventional mental health approaches are breaking down, and that they're not always getting to the root of the issue. And especially in the mental health field, a lot of times we're not even looking at the organ we're treating. We're not seeing what is going on behind the scenes. We're just seeing a set of symptoms, and then we're making educated guesses based off of those symptoms as to which interventions we use, which medications we use. But what we've found is that unfortunately, there's many different phenotypes or brain patterns associated with the same set of symptoms. So for example, things like ADHD. Typically, we tend to see an excess of theta brainwaves in the front of the brain, particularly the anterior cingulate. However, sometimes it's an excess of alpha brainwaves. Sometimes it's an excess of beta brainwaves. Sometimes they might have an excess of theta in the front, which are slower brainwaves, and then beta in the back, which are faster brainwaves. And so in those cases, for the typical theta pattern, things like stimulants, medications, might help to boost that brain activity to speed it up. However, in a lot of cases, that's not going to be the best fit. And in some cases, if you have slow brain waves in one part of the brain, but fast brain waves in another, we really need to be able to move the two different brain regions in two directions. So we have found that neurotherapy can be a really effective method for being able to move certain brain regions up, certain ones down, activate, deactivate, speed up, slow down. We can get very specific to what that particular person's brain needs. So we always start with a brain assessment, and we like to use electrical functional brain imaging because that gives us the most real-time assessment of a person's brain. So this utilizes the EEG technology, which is one of the safest neuroimaging technologies that can be repeatedly used without any harm. And from that EEG, we're able to use a technology called SW-Loretta that is able to localize where exactly that activity is coming from, even deeper down in the cortex. And this has been a game changer in the field of neurotherapy because in the past, we were limited to the traditional EEG, which means we could only see the surface level, kind of on that top inch of the cortex. And what we've found is that with the SW-Loretta, we're able to get to deeper regions like the amygdala, the thalamus, the posterior cingulate. And those are often the regions that everything's originating from, especially when we're dealing with mental health. Usually it's not that top layer of the cortex that's creating the problem, it's deeper down in the brain. So we utilize SW-Loretta 3D functional imaging. And with that technology, we're able to see exactly where the activity is in the brain, where it's stemming from, even deeper down. And then we're able to target those regions directly with the neurotherapy. One of the other benefits of the SW-Loretta technology is we're actually able to look at connectivity between regions. And we're finding that connectivity may be as important, if not more important, than the power within certain regions. So the connectivity is the flow of information between brain regions. And we really want to see if there are parts of the brain that are not communicating well, that are deficient in those communication processes. And we can also see if there are regions that are overly dependent on one another. So in this case, a region isn't operating independently enough and it's needing to recruit help from other regions. And both of those processes are going to affect the overall efficiency and effectiveness of the brain processes. Now, if we can look at the connectivity, if we can look at how an entire network within the brain is functioning, then with our neurotherapy technology, we can also target that entire network simultaneously. So this has been a game changer for us because not only can we target a specific brain region that is needing to be healed or balanced, but we can also train multiple brain regions simultaneously and the connectivity between them to address entire networks. And what we're finding in the neuroscience literature is a lot of times mental health issues, especially things like PTSD, tend to be related to the functioning of entire networks, not just single brain regions. Neurofeedback is essentially an advanced form of brain training that utilizes brain-computer interface technology to train the brain toward healthier patterns of functioning. So how we do this is we actually read the brain's activity in real time and then provide feedback with that information, usually in the form of audio and visual cues, to help the brain learn how to function differently and to show it new pathways. So there are many different types of neurofeedback, and we actually incorporate a variety of modalities here. We found that each one kind of has its own benefits and limitations. But the one that we tend to use the most, especially for those dealing with mental health challenges or learning difficulties, is the SW-Loretta neurofeedback. This is one of the most recent and most advanced forms of neurofeedback available, and it utilizes the SW-Loretta technology to provide that 3D deep brain neurofeedback training. So for this training, we essentially take all of the brain regions and frequencies, as well as all of the connectivity metrics that are outside healthy ranges, and we incorporate that into the brain-computer interface software. Then we connect the person's brain to some type of audio and visual feedback, usually in the form of a movie or music. And it doesn't really matter what kind of movie it is. They get to choose whatever they're motivated to see. But the key piece is that the movie is connected to their brain activity. So with all of the metrics from their brain assessment in our software, I like to imagine it like a globe, where these are all of the metrics that we're training in their brain. And then we're comparing their brain against other individuals their age who are healthy, high-functioning individuals. And we have a range of activity. We're not trying to make everybody exactly the same. But what we found is that when they are within that bell curve range, that's when they tend to feel the best. Whereas when they're outside the range, usually it's associated with a symptom. So I imagine it like this globe where these are all of the metrics in their brain, all the brain regions, connectivity metrics, frequencies, and then this is the healthy range of activity for each of those metrics. So if their brain is starting here, we set a threshold in the software saying, okay, we want all of these brain metrics to come one step closer to that healthy range. And when the brain does so, the movie zooms in and plays. When the brain pops outside that healthy range, the movie zooms out, sound goes out with it. So in the beginning, the brain may not realize that it's connected to the software, but over time it starts to put two and two together, and it realizes that, oh, whenever I do this, the movie zooms in. Whenever I do that, the movie zooms out. I'm going to keep doing more of this. And because the person wants to see the movie, they are trying to bring it full screen, the brain actually interprets that as a reward. And when the brain gets a sense of reward, it actually shoots out dopamine, which draws in these cells that wrap around the new connection and strengthen it. Okay, that's what forms a lot of that myelin sheath. And the thicker that layer becomes, the more automatic that pathway becomes. So over time, with more and more sessions, in the beginning we're taking the brain's hand and we're kind of showing it down a new pathway and rewarding every step of the way. It's kind of like dangling a carrot, and the brain comes this far, we give it a little nibble, then we take it one step further. And we're going to do that with each of those metrics until we get everything within that healthy range. But then we want to do enough sessions that we're really ingraining a new pathway. Because in the beginning, the brain's going to have a hard time finding that path on its own. It needs us to show it there, show it the way. And I see it like a grassy field where the brain is used to taking this pathway, and this pathway may be the long way around, and it may be swampy and stinky and ugly, but it's the only pathway the brain knows, especially if this is something that people have been struggling with for so many years. So with the neurotherapy, we're able to show the brain a new way of functioning, show it a new pathway that is healthier, that is bright and sunny and beautiful and more direct. And when we show the brain down that pathway enough times, we continue to pack it down so that the brain gets to a point where now this becomes the new automatic pathway the brain takes and the other starts to wither away. So this is how we're getting more long-term effects from the neurotherapy training. And one of the benefits of interventions like this is we're teaching the brain how to do it on its own. A lot of interventions or things like medications, they're coming in and they're doing it for the brain. But if the brain doesn't learn how to do it on its own, then as soon as you take that intervention away, the brain's just going to go back to the pathways it knows. Studies have shown that neurofeedback can actually change both the gray and white matter of the brain. So it's not only changing the function of the brain, it's also changing the structure. And that's what tends to create longer lasting improvements. One of the other interventions we tend to use here at NeuroGrove is neurostimulation. We found that neurostimulation is really great for providing more immediate relief to our clients. So a lot of times, by the time people get to us, they've tried a lot of things and they've been struggling for many years. So they are ready for relief. And what we found is that the neurostimulation can help provide that relief. The way I see it, some types of neurostimulation are kind of like coming in with a wrecking ball, and some of them are kind of like a sledgehammer. But the types that we use, we see them more like chisels. So we're going in, we're seeing exactly what the brain needs, and then we're just kind of nudging it in a different direction, helping it to adjust its activity. So what we've found is that when certain brain regions are overactive, such as those fight or flight centers, we can actually use the neurostimulation to help calm those brain regions faster. Now, oftentimes with stimulation, we tend to think that we are boosting activity, but there are certain types that can actually work with the GABA in the brain to calm it down. So one of the forms of neurostimulation that we use is transcranial direct current stimulation. And with that, we have two electrodes. One of them is the cathode, which is inhibiting, and one is the anode, which is activating. So in cases such as PTSD, we oftentimes will see that the limbic system, the emotion centers of the brain, are overactive, whereas the prefrontal regions, the parts of the brain that are needed for our emotional regulation and a lot of our higher level cognitive processes like thinking, decision-making, planning, those regions tend to be underactive. So with the direct current stimulation, we can actually essentially flip the two, where we're calming down the overactive regions and boosting up the underactive regions. And we can do that more quickly and effectively with the neurostimulation. We also do another type of neurostimulation called transcranial alternating current stimulation, and that one's really beneficial for putting in certain frequencies that might be deficient in the brain. So for example, we might see that a person has a deficiency of alpha brainwaves in the back of their brain. Alpha generally tends to be this good-feely, relaxed brainwave frequency, and if we're deficient in that, then of course we're going to have a harder time relaxing and feeling good. So sometimes in those cases, we could use the neurostimulation to actually boost those alpha frequencies in the back of the brain using the transcranial alternating current stimulation. In other cases, such as in cases of ADHD, if we see an excess of slow brainwaves in the front of the brain, we can actually help to put in faster brainwave frequencies to speed it up and boost their attention, their focus, their cognitive function, as well as impulse control. Electromagnetic fields affect the body on a cellular level by opening up the membranes. So it's essentially like opening up the windows. And when you do that, you actually allow the oxygen and nutrients to flow into the cell more easily. And you also allow some of the waste and the toxins to come out of the cell. And so what we've found with this is, yes, we can use it at particular frequencies according to what each individual's brain needs. So we can help boost certain frequencies that might be deficient or that could just be helpful for stabilizing the brain. But we can also use it to help clean out and help each cell function at its best, because when every cell in a brain region is functioning at its best, then of course that brain region is going to be doing its job at its best. So it's extremely important to get to the root of the issue, and it's my hope that people will realize from this that there are ways that you can see what's at the root of what you're struggling with that is keeping you trapped in your experience, and realize that there is hope to heal.